When the Poles demanded a Red Cross inquiry into the murders at Katyn, Stalin broke off diplomatic relations with Sikorsky's government. He accused them of collaborating with Hitler.
Of course, we were pretty horrified, but we were not quite so directly affected, and so we were able still to think in terms of what can we salvage from this in terms of a continuing Polish-Soviet relationship.
In Russia, Stalin now fostered Poles, friendly to the Soviet Union.
Poles from all parts of Poland, Poles from all parts of the Soviet Union, people of different outlooks and political convictions. Today we are united by a great common aim, following the same common road.
Deported Poles who had not joined the Anders army were recruited into a new force.
Obviously, they didn't get to know the Soviet Union from the best side. And at the beginning, their attitude to the Soviet Union and to the army was one of distrust. Gradually, however, this distrust disappeared once they realized that the army was of a national nature, with all the Polish emblems, hymns, and decorations.
Przysięgam dochować wierności sojuszniczej. Przysięgam dochować wierności sojuszniczej. Związkowi Radzieckiemu. Związkowi Radzieckiemu. Który mi dał do ręki broń. Który dał do ręki broń. Przysięga miała charakter.
The oath had a religious character, just as the whole army did then. The oath, I would say, was of a political and religious nature. We swore to God, but we also swore an oath which spoke of Polish-Soviet friendship and of our common fight against Hitlerism.
The new troops marched under the Polish and Allied flags. But this Polish army did not recognize Sikorsky's government. Most of the officers came from the Soviet army. Polish soldiers in Scotland training for their paratroop wings.
100 human falcons swoop upon their prey.
Sikorsky hoped these men would be dropped into Poland to support uprisings planned by the underground Home Army.
The attack has been successful. The enemy routed, the dress rehearsal is over. The day will soon come when they will use those wings as the return half of their round-trip ticket from Poland. Outward by the longest route, homeward by the shortest, by air. Poland awaits her sons.
June 1943. Sikorsky visited the Anders Army in the Middle East. He was planning an effort to restore relations with the Soviet Union and hoping that the Anders Army would join forces with the British to liberate Poland from the south through the Balkans. Sikorsky started back to London. A few hours after this photograph was taken, his plane crashed into the sea off Gibraltar. A British court of inquiry declared that the crash was an accident. Only the pilot survived. Some suspected that the Russians or the British were behind the accident, but there was no evidence of that. Through the English countryside, the body of Poland's leader was escorted to a Polish military cemetery. Sikorsky's skill had unified the disparate factions of the scattered Polish community. He could not easily be replaced. By his coffin, the Polish government brooded on the future. Sikorsky had been both commander-in-chief and prime minister. Now the leadership divided. General Sosenkowski commanded the forces. Stanislaw Mikołajczyk became prime minister. They inherited a movement that was now in disarray. Polish soldiers were fighting alongside the British in the Middle East. In Russia, another Polish army was sworn to Moscow. Would the Russians or the West liberate Poland? Sikorski's successors were torn by disagreements. Poland would rise from the tomb they knew, but when would it rise, and in what form? The day after Sikorski's funeral, there began at Kursk in Russia a huge tank battle that would prove a turning point in the European war. The Soviet armies now began to take the offensive. 2 months later, September 1943, recruits of the new Polish army in Russia moved to the front. General Zygmunt Berling was their Polish commander.
Admittedly, we weren't adequately prepared. But September the 1st was the anniversary of the outbreak of war. We emphasized that by September the 1st, we must leave for the front.
General Berling and his political commissar planned the first battle. It took place at Lenino. The Poles fought with courage and proved themselves a reliable ally for the Red Army. In Scotland, the new Prime Minister, Mikołajczyk, inspected his Polish troops. Mikołajczyk, leader of the Peasant Party, Poland's largest political movement, was ready to compromise over the eastern frontier with the Soviet Union if he could be certain that Poland would regain full independence after the war. But his commander-in-chief, General Sosnkowski, was opposed to any concessions.
Here I was between two people, the Prime Minister and the Commander-in-Chief, who were almost not on speaking terms with each other. If I was too close to Mikołajczyk, Sosnkowski could become instantly suspicious of me. If I was too close to Sosnkowski, then Mikołajczyk wouldn't trust me.
Everything you have suffered has been noted in the books of eternal justice and shall become the germ of a new and happier life. We shall go on through land and sea, through mountains and rivers, through forests and steppes, with faith in our hearts and the image of our motherland in our thoughts and our longing.
Sosnkowski was, first of all, totally distrustful of the Allies. He believed that British government is simply trying to find a face-saving formula to retreat from its commitment to Poland, legal commitments and moral commitments. He was very gloomy in his prophecies about the Soviet policy and behavior. He was sure that Poland will become another Soviet republic.
Let the future generations of Poles in a free and happy Poland, remembering the time of fire and flood, say about us that the Polish soldier, at the great turning point of history, has done his duty to the end.
He was predicting at least a political conflict and maybe even a military conflict between the West and the East. And in that situation, he felt there may be another chance for Poland. Mikołajczyk was excluding the possibility of war. He believed what Churchill told him, there will be no Third World War in next 10, 20, 30 years.
Mikołajczyk's cabinet could not agree on a frontier compromise with the Soviet Union. Britain and the United States grew impatient.
We had to bring pressure to bear a good deal, I think, to say, well, now, look, what is going to happen after the war if you haven't got some kind of agreement with the Russians? Their army is going to, as they would say, liberate, and other people might say occupy Poland, and we can't stop it. I mean, we had no means of stopping it.
The British and United States delegations flew eastwards to keep another appointment with destiny, to Tehran, young capital of the new Persia.
As the delegations prepared for the Allied conference at Tehran, Stalin insisted that for security reasons, Roosevelt should move into the Soviet embassy. It was there in December 1943 that Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill sat down together for the first time to decide their strategy for the final defeat of Germany. Stalin's voice at the conference proved the strongest. Churchill abandoned his scheme for an Anglo-American drive into Eastern Europe from Italy and the Balkans. Eastern Europe was to be liberated and occupied by the Red Army alone. To extend his influence deeper into Europe, Stalin wanted Polish boundaries shifted to the west. The Allied leaders agreed. The Soviet Union would take the pre-war Polish territories east of the Curzon line. In compensation, Poland would be given German lands to the west and along the Baltic coast. The Polish government was neither consulted nor informed.
The Polish government cannot recognize unilateral decisions or fait accompli, which have taken place or may take place on the territory of the Polish Republic. Nevertheless, it has frequently given expression to a sincere desire to achieve an understanding with the Soviet Union on a just basis acceptable to both sides.
He did see the necessity of trying to reach the best terms possible with Russia, but at the same time, he had to carry along with him many of his colleagues who were by no means ready to do that.
Polish government, scene 3, take 2, Polish.
With this in mind, the Polish government is asking the British and American governments to intervene and bring about talks between the Polish and Soviet governments.
Washington, June 1944. Mikołajczyk had 4 meetings with Roosevelt. The president assured Poland of his support. It was an election year and he needed the Polish-American vote. Unknown to Mikołajczyk, Roosevelt cabled Stalin confirming the secret decisions of Tehran.
Marshal Rokossovsky, commander of the Soviet armies in Poland, watches his men advance to the crossing of the river Bug on the road to Lublin.
As Soviet troops entered territory which all the Allies agreed was Polish, Stalin turned to the problem of who would govern liberated Poland. Already he had revived the small Polish Communist Party.
One must realize that this was a party in constant opposition, not only to the government, but to the whole system of government in Poland before the war. That it was a cursed party, that it was a persecuted party, that it was a party that had been destroyed by Stalin.
Most Poles still supported the government in exile, which urged the resistance to welcome the advancing Red Army in the name of Poland's legal government. In Moscow, Stalin was putting together his own Polish administration, communists and others who would accept Soviet policies.
These matters could be best resolved for Poland only by a government of the left, a government capable of reaching an understanding with the Soviet Union.
As the Red Army advanced into Poland, pro-Soviet Poles met in Moscow intending to form a government. But Stalin had another plan.
The Polish Committee of National Liberation was brought into being in Moscow on the 21st of July, 1944.
The committee represented none of the main political parties. They agreed to shift the Polish-Russian border to the west. Most Polish soldiers advancing with the Red Army lost their homes to the Soviet Union.
After a while, of course, they realized that the Polish eastern frontier would be moved west. They accepted this in various ways, some with sorrow. But in the end, they understood this to be an historical necessity.
Under Nazi occupation, 3 million Polish Jews were exterminated. In all, 6 million Polish subjects met their death. Four years of terror were ended by the Red Army. While Poles rejoiced, Soviet security troops were rounding up and disarming home army units loyal to the government in exile. The resistance organized local uprisings against the retreating Germans. The Red Army advanced. In Warsaw, the home army commanders argued about their next move. Reports from London were not encouraging.
I briefed them about Mikołajczyk's views, and my clear conclusion was that the Soviets will be in control of Poland, and that they will be in a position to do here whatever they like. I really made no illusions whatsoever that our cause is lost. And they were listening with gloom. It was clear that these people are in terrible situation.
Stalin all the time claimed that so-called home army, underground government, all this institution of underground state are a fiction. So if we don't start fighting, his accusation would be confirmed vis-a-vis the Western world. He would say, look, our troops liberated Warsaw. We didn't find any home army, any underground government.
From the morning until dawn, they were broadcasting appeals, we are close, you hear our guns. This is the moment to raise in arms, to prevent the bridges from being blown, and to help the Red Army to cross the river and to occupy the city.
We decided to liberate Warsaw by our own force and then welcome Soviet troops as our allies, as hosts in our own house.
On August 1st, 1944, 42,000 poorly armed soldiers started the Warsaw Uprising. It was to last for 63 days. The Germans were caught off balance. This was the biggest mass revolt the Nazis had faced in Europe. The people of Warsaw celebrated their early victories. The underground state had come out into the open. The population was united. Even Warsaw's communists fought under the orders of the Home Army.
The uprising began in an atmosphere of enormous enthusiasm. This was the one piece of free Poland retrieved after so many years of German occupation. The popular belief was that the uprising would be victorious. The first disillusionment came only when we realized that the uprising did not take in the whole of Warsaw.
The Warsaw Uprising had begun while Mikołajczyk was in Moscow meeting Stalin.
When the insurrection broke out, Mikołajczyk begged Stalin to help. Stalin pretended during the first 3 or 4 days that nothing happened, that the whole insurrection was bogus, there was no insurrection of Warsaw, and so on.
The uprising started just as the Germans halted the Red Army's advance about 8 miles east of Warsaw. Stalin complained that the Home Army had acted without Soviet agreement. He refused to help.
Warsaw was bombed by shuttling service of 6 or 7 German bombers who had the airport near the city and were simply bringing the bombs and dropping them, going back, coming back, and it was a systematic carpet bombing with no interference from the Soviets at all.
The Western Allies begged Stalin to relieve Warsaw. He refused, calling the uprising a mindless brawl mounted by adventurers. When Roosevelt and Churchill proposed supplying Warsaw by air, Stalin denied them the use of Soviet airfields. As ammunition ran out, the insurgents cannibalized unexploded bombs and shells. Improvised munitions factories flourished.
This is Warsaw calling. Warsaw calling. Warsaw calling all the free nations. In the fighting now taking place on Polish soil, the Polish Home Army is using every available means to support the action of the Soviet forces. So doing, the Home Army is carrying out the decision of the Polish government and is also loyally obeying the orders of its superior authorities in London.
The Home Army had planned to liberate Warsaw within days. They ran out of ammunition, out of food and medicine in what became a 2-month siege. Slowly, the Germans fought their way across Warsaw.
Auch SS-Verbände werden mit panzerbrechenden Waffen eingesetzt.
There were districts where the population was slaughtered street by street. Hitler ordered Warsaw to be erased.
We were walked through the streets of burning Warsaw. We could see the flames engulfing our home.
Płomienie ogarniają nasz dom.
Houses were being set on fire, one by one. We were terrified, bewildered. We didn't know what was going to happen to us.
The population retreated into the streets that were still in Polish hands. 1 month after the uprising began, the old city district could no longer hold out. A rescue mission was launched.
The general was terribly impatient that the Poles do not make a progress, that they were expecting to attack the Germans, and there was very little progress. So I remember we were operating in ruins. There was not one house untouched at that time. And in my presence, he scolded an officer who said, "Why don't you move? Your job is to blow this wall and to attack." He said, "Sir, we cannot do it because the courtyard is under the German fire. They know that we are there and we will be decimated there." A few minutes later, I saw a massacre. There were girls with the mines, and the grenades were dropped one after the others, and most of the wounds were legs, so that most of them were without legs after they were, transported from I don't know how many people were killed in front of me, and I felt it was senseless, because we had such the odds were so overwhelmingly against us that to push these young people, they were all youngsters, 18, 17, 16. Many of them were girls. They were extremely brave. Their job was to go with these mines and to blow this wall. So they were screams. Since they have their bottle with gasoline to throw against the tanks, the gasoline was blew up, so you had a fire. It was a macabre scene from Dante, really. And all was unnecessary because our people in the old city found a way through the sewers, and they were rescued through the sewers. So that the whole effort was, frankly, waste of human lives. And I remember this poor officer when he was taken with terrible wounds, and he was bleeding profusely. And he just said to this general, "I obeyed the orders."
By this time, there was no longer any belief that we would be victorious.
Nie było już wiary, że zwyciężymy.
But there was still the desire to resist, to fight to the end.
Do końca.
By September 15th, Soviet forces, including the Polish army under General Berling, had reached the riverbank opposite Warsaw.
I would like to have thrown myself straight into that river and gone across.